So I've been doing clinical neuropsychology for 31 years, and over the last few years I've been really thinking about what's the most useful stuff that I've learned about different topics in my field. And I want to talk for just a few minutes today about the 5 most useful things I've learned about kids' brains. And the first thing is that the development of the prefrontal cortex is remarkably protracted. And what I mean by that is that the prefrontal cortex, which is right behind your forehead, does the executive functions of inhibiting and planning and organizing and working memory, is extremely slow to develop. And I remember reading in 1992 that there's this dramatic spurt in the frontal cortex between 17 and 20. And we know now that the cognitive functions of the prefrontal cortex aren't really mature until 25 plus minus 3, and the emotional regulation functions of the prefrontal cortex aren't mature until 32 plus minus 3. Males tend to be on the plus 3 side, and kids with ADHD tend to be more delayed. And the reason that this has been probably the most important thing I've learned, or most useful thing I've learned, is it's been so profoundly reassuring to many parents of kids who were not doing well at age 10 or 12 or 15 or 21, to know that if we can stay reasonably chilled out and communicate confidence that kids can figure stuff out, they'll have a different brain in 2 years, a very different brain in 4 years or 6 years. And I've had dozens of people tell me that one of the most useful things I ever heard was about how this prefrontal cortex is so slow to develop and what this means for late bloomers. The second point is that the developing brain's most important function is survival. And it's been very useful to me to think about how deeply wired we are to protect ourselves, to survive. The very most primitive parts of our brain are not involved in planning and decision making. They're involved in simply reacting and protecting us and initiating our stress response when we have to adapt to situations that are unfamiliar or potentially threatening. And the reason this has been so useful for me to know is that when you understand that, it helps me understand that anytime that the primitive parts of our brain sense some kind of threat, the prefrontal cortex, which can think, shuts down. Because when you're threatened, that you're supposed to respond instinctively. We're programmed to respond instinctively and not to be able to think clearly and not to be able to think what's the best thing to do in the situation. We're supposed to react, often in a very defensive and even stereotyped way. And it's thinking about kids trying to learn when they're stressed. It just doesn't make any sense knowing that. If they're stressed, it means that the part of their brain is sensing threat and shutting down the part of the brain that can actually think and learn. And the third thing is that the developing brain is very active, even at rest. And what I mean by that is that the research on what happens when kids sleep is absurdly compelling in terms of the ability to make connections that allow motor skill development. You can work on a motor skill for an hour before you go to bed, and you can get up to the point where you're 70% proficient, and you can sleep for 8 hours, get up the next morning, and you're up to 90% without any additional practice. And we also know that the brain replays what it learns during the day, it integrates, it can remember detail if it sleeps, that during the night, that so much goes on related to learning, emotional healing, and it just helped me place a huge value on sleep, and really the idea, rest really is the basis of activity, and that the sense that if you're very well rested, it makes a dramatic difference at all ages in your ability to think, your ability to feel, your ability to function. And also, just this idea when there's a part of the brain that most people don't know about it's called the default mode network. And it's this network in the brain that only activates when you're not focused on something. So if you're just sitting, if I was just sitting here without my phone or anything to think about, I'd think about myself and I think about my family and my life and stuff that's happened to me. I might think about some difficult situation and how to resolve it. And what we know is that this default mode network is really important. And it's really important for a kid's development of identity. Because think about it, the way you get a sense of who you are is you think about yourself and you reflect on yourself. And it makes me really want to make sure that kids have enough downtime in their life that they can actually, that they aren't constantly involved in doing something. That they have some time to daydream, to fool around, and actually think about themselves. It seems to be a really important function for development. The fourth point is that the developing brain craves autonomy. And the most stressful thing in the universe is a low sense of control. And that can mean when we feel like we're being coerced, or we feel like there's nothing we can do about a situation. And much of my work now, and my buddy Ned Johnson, we're working on a book together on this sense of control. And I think that it's one of the most useful things I've ever learned is how valuable it is for kids to have a strong sense of autonomy. And I know it's, if having a strong sense of autonomy lowers your stress level, which it does, it has to be important, because being chronically stressed is really not good for anything. And we also know that from research on motivation, that from many different angles, a strong sense of autonomy is the key for kids to become self-motivated adolescents and adults. And so that knowing how important a sense of autonomy, a sense of control about their own life, that I'm not helpless, I'm not chronically overwhelmed, that I can manage things in my life. It's so important. It's made me very strong about wanting kids, even younger kids, to practice making decisions. What's important to you? How do you think this should go? Does it make sense? Which school would be best for you? I want kids practicing making their own decisions because this sense of autonomy is such a big deal. And it's a big deal for motivation, for stress, for health, longevity. I mean, think about it, why is being in a traffic jam so stressful? Because you have such a low sense of control. There's nothing you can do about it. And the fifth thing is that kids' brains today are about like they were 10,000 years ago. Now, there's a lot being said about how the way technology is rewiring kids' brains, and that's true to the extent that different connections are being made in the cortex that make certain brain functions look different. However, the more primitive parts of the brain that regulate stress, that determine how much sleep we need, some of the most basic functions that really determine the quality of our life, are about like they were 10,000 years ago or more. We know, for example, that the stress response, that the parts of our brain that activate and carry out the stress response, the fight or flight response, it's pretty much like as if you're responding to a woolly mammoth. And the brain doesn't know much difference between being late for an assignment or being embarrassed as it does from being attacked by a predator. And knowing this has been extremely useful to me, in part coming back to the stress piece, knowing that we all have these very primitive parts of our brain that are trying to protect us, and that all the technology in the world doesn't change the fact that for us to function well, we have to feel safe. And for kids to function well and to learn well, they have to feel safe. And the other part of this is interesting, and especially in the work with learning disabilities, is that it's the same brain systems that have been listening to language and speaking are the brain systems that are involved in reading comprehension and written expression. And knowing this with kids with learning disabilities, if they have trouble reading words, I want them to be listening. I want them to be activating these very primitive brain systems. Not primitive, they're well developed now, but they're very old. And that we've been listening to each other talk for 50,000 years or more. And so these are the 5 things that in my 30 years of work have been the most useful to me. I hope they're useful to you.